Welcome, folks. We're going to give it another minute or two before we get started, but happy to have you join us today for the NARUC Financial Toolbox webinar on ADMS and DERMS. So we'll get started in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the NARUC Financial Toolbox webinar on ADMS and DERMS. My name is Danielle Sass-Burnett. I am NARUC's Director for the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and we're happy to have you join us today. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be posted on the NARUC website after the event. Next slide. Most of you know, since you're here, but NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Our members are the state utility commissioners in all 50 states and the territories, and they regulate the electric, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utility in their states. Next slide. Today's webinar is organized by NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. We are a technical assistance team providing support to commissioners and commission staff across the country on emerging issues that are challenging to consider and complex to make decisions around. We do this through building relationships, developing resources, delivering trainings, and hosting events, workshops, and webinars. You can find out more information about other resources we have available and upcoming events on the NARUC website at naruc.org/CPI. And today's event is part of the Financial Toolbox series. The Financial Toolbox series is a collection of resources on different technologies and their intersection with regulation. The technologies we've considered so far include those supporting resilience, communications, AMI, cloud computing, building electrification, and community solar for low and moderate income residents. And in each case, we're exploring the status of the technology, its benefits, its adoption, and how regulatory accounting treatment works for this technology, since there, in most cases, has been relatively limited uptake in the utility sector. So you can find the past presentations, recordings, and also 10 to 15 page summary briefs with links for more detailed information on the NARUC website, and we'll put the URL in the chat. Next slide. So for today, we're really excited to be exploring the topics of ADMS and DERMS, and grateful to have our esteemed speakers and Commissioner Vice Chair Joe Sullivan from the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission to moderate the event today. Commissioner Sullivan, can I hand things over to you for introduction? You are still muted.
It's amazing. We've been doing this for as long as we have, and we still make those little common mistakes. But thank you, Danielle, and thank you for the introduction. And I very much appreciate the invitation by NARUC to participate in this the seminar, and I'm looking forward to the presentations and the conversation. As you had indicated, this is a part of NARUC webinar series exploring the types of financial tools utility regulators can use, and in this instance, in particular, to support the integration of electricity system technologies that are beneficial to the public interest. Today, we have a great panel, and that where we'll be looking at these questions from several perspectives. From the vendor perspective, Dr. Ali Ipachaki will be presenting to us. We have Chris Villarreal, who's the president of Plugged In Strategies, and Mr. Ted Burhans will be speaking to us from the utility perspective, and Commissioner Catherine Paratek will be speaking to us from the utility perspective. What I'd like to do quickly is give a little bit of background on our panelists and speak to you or talk about their bios. So Chris Villarreal, I know Chris well. He's been involved in Minnesota energy work for a long time, but Chris has worked in the regulatory policy industry for more than 20 years, including 11 years as staff at the California PUC and the Minnesota PUC. In that time, Chris has led initiatives on topics such as grid modernization, rate design reform, data access and data privacy, cybersecurity, and energy storage. Chris is currently the president of Plugged In Strategies, where he advises federal, state, and nonprofit and other clients on grid modernization efforts, as well as a number of other matters. Dr. Ali Ipachaki is the executive vice president of Smart Grid and Green Power at Open Access Technology International, OATI. As the executive vice president, he is responsible for product development as well as business growth and distribution, grid modernization, and smart grid areas. Prior to working for OATI, Dr. Ipachaki was vice president of integration services at Kima Consulting, where he assisted utility clients and with roadmap specifications, implementation strategies for operational and automation systems, particularly in the smart grid area. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he is based in California. Ted Burhans is the director of grid deployment at the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Ted joined SEPA in June 2020. He oversees the growing body of work focused on analytics of grid conditions and control of distributed energy resources, whether in front of the meter or behind the meter. Ted has more than 15 years of experience working with utilities, most recently directing renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electric vehicle programs. He has a BS in engineering management and MBA, and he is based in Tucson, Arizona. And Commissioner Catherine Paratek is our final presenter. Commissioner Paratek is with the Michigan Public Service Commission. She was appointed to the Michigan Public Service Commission on January 4th, 2021, and reappointed on July 3rd, 2021. Prior to her appointment, Commissioner Paratek worked in the public and private sectors with a focus on energy storage and technology development, and her past experience includes work at an International Energy Storage Project, project engineering for long-duration energy storage technology, and as a mechanical engineer with a wind turbine manufacturer. Ms. Paratek holds a BS in mechanical engineering and master's in energy systems engineering, and she is based in Michigan. So with that, we'll move to our presentations. Chris, I don't see you on the webinar yet, but I know you are here. So with that, Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sullivan, and thank you, NARUC, for inviting me to participate in today's session on ADMS and DERMS. If we can move to the next slide. I'm here to talk about a report that that DOE funded me and two other people to write, building off of prior DOE materials called Voices of Experience. And the purpose of these Voices of Experience documents is to gather the insight and the perspectives from the people on the ground who are actually reviewing and developing and proposing a variety of technologies. And so for this one, we decided to look at what are the experiences, especially from the regulatory side, as it applies to the deployment and review of ADMS and DERMS systems. This report represents the perspectives and the insights provided in our conversations with state regulators. At its high level, it identified 4 priority topics for us to review in this document. So this document details a whole slew of other technologies, as well as provide some high-level findings and overarching perspectives that we got from our conversations with regulators. In addition to that, not only did we go out and talk to the regulators to hear their perspectives on ADMS and DERMS, but we also did a review of over 100 dockets across the United States in front of state commissions that looked at utility proposals for ADMS and DERMS. And there's a separate volume attached to this report that goes over what those dockets are and provides links to the materials. Next slide, please. So this report was funded by DOE's Office of Electricity, again, building on prior materials from DOE under the Voices of Experience heading. So we did 2 rounds of meetings with regulators, commissioners and staff across the country. And we ended up talking to over 200 participants from 26 different states to gather their input on their experiences in reviewing proposals for ADMS and DERMS, and what their experiences were in the review process, but also what were the lessons that they learned after the review and implementation of the ADMS and DERMS. So the report collects all of those findings and puts them together in a set that would allow a reader to go and look at them and see what are the questions that regulators really want to know about ADMS and DERMS. What are the lessons learned, if any, from states that have reviewed and approved or rejected ADMS and DERMS? And what are the perspectives of those states that have not looked at it to date? What type of questions are they anticipating wanting addressed in any utility application for an ADMS or DERMS filing? Next slide, please. So the report covers 3 primary technology areas: distribution control technologies, AMI electric vehicles, and we also added 2 other sections related to data, since all 3 of these technology areas are all predicated upon the collection and generation of new data. So what can be used with the data that's collected from those, as well as a subcomponent of the EV conversation, which is how are the state agencies coordinating amongst themselves in order to deploy and plan for electric vehicles. You can read more about all these components in the report, but for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the distribution control technologies section of this report. Next slide, please. So before I get into the report, I just want to make sure that I lay the groundwork that what to expect out of this report. This is, as I said, the collective voice of the regulators based on the conversations that the drafting team had with state commissions. This is not a how-to guide for necessarily any state commission or regulator or vendor to ensure cost recovery. This is simply recognizing that there are a lot of perspectives around this country. There are a lot of expectations, perspectives, and viewpoints that we're trying to capture. And so these are high-level summary findings from the report based on our conversations with regulators that we hope are useful in the development of questions that a regulator may want to ask, or how a utility may want to propose and what needs to be in an application for an ADMS and DERMS system. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did in the section on distribution controls is that we had to describe what was an ADMS and DERMS system. So the picture on the left side of your screen is taken from prior DOE materials. It provides a high-level perspective of what an ADMS system is to do, as well as a DERMS system. So the ADMS system really is there to provide oversight and coordination and a bit of control across multiple utility systems. So we're really talking about integrating a variety of alphabet soup systems such as GIS, OMS, and distribution SCADA, all under one suite of control and programming. components of that overarching suite include something like a DERM system. So when we think about ADMS, ADMS is the bigger component of ensuring that the distribution system has a common platform under which all the other components are part of it. The DERM system is one of those components that fits underneath an ADMS system. And so to the right, we have our definitions of what these technologies mean. I will not go through them, but suffice to say, we're talking about the implementation and application of new software to be implemented by utilities to ensure the overarching reliability and operation of the system. Before I move to the next slide, I do want to note that on the next slide, I'll talk about a bunch of I's that really get into understanding how this works. But I want to talk about here briefly is one of the I's is interoperability. And as you can see from this perspective, there are now lots of new pieces that may in the past have been physically separated from each other. But with an ADMS system, they all now have to come under one roof, so to speak. So the interoperability of all these new software systems that are going to be put together under an ADMS suite, interoperability becomes an important component to ensure that the ADMS system itself is operating the way it's supposed to and then is operating cost effectively. Because if the communications and the data fields from the myriad alphabet soup of software are not interoperable, then that's going to increase the cost of the ADMS system. So ensuring that these are all interoperable becomes a really important component and consideration in review of these investments. Next slide, please. So when we met with the commission, when we met with staff, these were our high-level findings and expectations for what an ADMS and DERM system are capable of doing. So what regulators understand and anticipate is an explanation of how ADMS and DERMs are actually going to do more interesting things. How are they going to provide visibility and better granularity in the distribution system? How are these resources, in fact, then going to help integrate distributed energy resources or be responsive to growth of distributed energy resources? And then how can a regulator unpack the costs and benefits of these investments, recognizing that the pathway may be lumpy over time? And as a result, as the picture in the prior slide showed, there are lots of things that need to be integrated and aligned so that the ADMS system is done in a way that is done at a lower cost and does not have things that don't work with it. So understanding the distribution system planning initiative and efforts to ensure that the ADMS is coordinated appropriately with other utility investments, that becomes another important component that the regulators we talked to was really wanting to see. So I'll just really touch on the picture on the right. So a way to think about, from what we heard from the regulators about the distribution, understanding distribution controls like ADMS and DERMS, are to focus on the 4 I's. And this is sort of how we summarize everything. So the first I relates to interfaces. So remember from the picture before, ADMS has to interface with multiple components of utility operations and planning systems. So how do you make sure that those interfaces are identified and that those interfaces are appropriately accounted for and planned for when investing and planning for an ADMS system? The second I is then integration. So once you've identified all the interfaces, how do you make sure that those interfaces then are integrated appropriately into the ADMS and DERM system? The third I are the interdependencies. So now that you've identified the interfaces, what else then are interdependent upon all the other different pieces? So are you just going to have an ADMS system that sits on a standalone basis while everything else works around it? Or are you really going to try to integrate it with all the different pieces across the utility to ensure that this is in fact fully integrated with utility systems? And then the fourth one, of course, is making sure this is interoperable. Next slide, please. So what we heard in our conversation with regulators is that there is a steep learning curve, that regulators really have just a very limited sense of what an ADMS and DERM systems are capable of doing. And so there's a lot more education and understanding from the regulatory perspective of what purpose do these technologies have? What are they to serve? Which then goes into understand the costs and benefits of these investments. As a result, planning becomes really important. So just plopping down an ADMS and DERMS proposal without any associated planning really then has resulted in some confusion amongst the regulators that we talk to. So having a clear, thought out and short, medium, and long-term plan consistent with a distribution system plan really helps identify where and how an ADMS and DERMS system can be integrated and invested in appropriately over a time period. And then contingent on that, of course, how do you identify the right time to invest in an ADMS and DERMS system? So what I've had here is just some cut and paste from the questions. I won't focus on any of them, but they're here for your review. I'll just highlight briefly that a lot of them deal with planning, some of them deal with understanding the operations, and the last one, of course, deals with the costs and benefits. So pretty, part and parcel of what you'd expect a regulator to ask, but what the regulators we talk to are looking at wanting more detailed information about the ADMS and DERMS proposals. Next slide, please. So I just want to give you just a bit of highlights from some of the resources that you'll find in the document. DOE, several years ago in 2015, did a standalone ADMS Voices of Experience that focuses solely on the utilities. So if you go and if you Google this report, you'll find an ADMS report that is from the utility perspective, the utilities who had done an ADMS system back in 2015, what were their lessons learned? And it's a really important and valuable document for regulators to look at because this provides the perspective of the utilities. And so what would a utility tell another utility about planning for an ADMS system? And then as you go through the report, you'll find also examples from other state commissions that have issued orders on ADMS and DERMS. So I just highlighted here two, one from the Kentucky Public Service Commission and one from the Virginia State Corporation Commission. And you can, if you download the paper, you can read all about all the other different state commission actions, including the actions of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Next slide, please. And with that, I want to thank NARUC and Commissioner Sullivan for having me today. As I said, this is a three-person project, so I want to thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And I wanted to say too, in preparation for the webinar, I went and I reviewed the paper that you put together, and I found it to be very useful and helpful. And certainly it was nice to see that, we were not alone. Minnesota is not alone in the questions that we had and our lessons learned. So I very much appreciated that about the report, and thank you for putting it together and being a part of it and speaking to it today. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Epakci, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name.
Perfect.
We're very much looking forward to hearing your perspective as a vendor. I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sullivan. If you can move to the next slide. I'm going, first of all, we as a vendor have been working with utilities, aggregators, and markets and reliability coordinators across the nation for past so many years. And the presentation I'm going to give is more of a reflection of experience or observations we have had through delivery, looking at requirements from our customers' perspective, and some of the requirements that involve delivering, deploying, and operating these systems. As a background, what we kind of see happening in the nation with the growth of renewable resources, wind and solar in particular, which are variable in nature. The system operation at the bulk level requires additional balancing energy, additional fast ramping, additional flexibility to maintain the variability of the intermittent resources that are fast growing. At the same time, there is a fair amount of kind of a advancements happening on the demand side with a growth of smart thermostats, smart appliances, smart meters, 5G communications, and connectivity, all the loads and things of that nature, EVs and chargers and alike. And the fact that those resources can be remotely controlled, monitored, and controlled. There is a fair amount of opportunity for leveraging demand-side flexibility to address variability of other types of resources, whether variability comes on the load variability because of the growth of solar or other types of resources or electrification, or need for system operation and reliable operation of the broader grid. The integration of demand side with the overall system operation is becoming an important consideration. And of course, distribution side sits in the middle. And the resources that are at the edge of the grid offering services, first of all, they may impact the reliability of distribution grid, but also they can help improving economics and reliability of broader system. So the area of ADMS and DERMS becoming more and more a critical requirement for basically leveraging flexibilities that are available on the demand side to address economic objectives, as well as addressing their potential impact on the distribution side with respect to reliability, but also leveraging economic benefits and capabilities they can provide in overall integrated power system operations. If we move to the next slide, in that light, both ADMS and DERMS play a very important role. I'll try to make some key differentiation between these two functionality. The ADMS is very critical component, critical system to basically maintain reliability of distribution grid. And it is traditionally it was designed to basically operate with the distribution grid equipment, monitor voltages, flows, manage switching, and of course it's as Chris mentioned, components of ADMS being DMS, OMS, and distribution SCADA address outages, system restoration, and an maintain overall system distribution grid, maintain reliability of distribution operation. In that context, users of ADMS are primarily control center operators, but as Chris mentioned, its integration, its interoperability with rest of operation, very critical, rest of utility systems and on overall system operations. Now, DERMS has emerged as a system that basically manages customer-owned or third-party-owned asset, as well as utility-owned assets. But with the growth of customer-owned assets or third-party-owned assets on the distribution side, there is a fair amount of need to deal with commercial aspects of those relationships. As assets are owned by entities outside of the utility, tariffs and other commercial frameworks have to be applied in their operation and their utilization. So there is a number of functionalities that are kind of emerging as a requirement to be able to leverage distributed resources, which has some commercial aspects to it: contracts, agreements, enrollments into the programs, terms and conditions for control of those assets, etc. So the DERMS basically augments the ADMS functionalities by bringing in the commercial aspect of operation, in addition to other things needed to aggregate those, to be able to create dispatchable capabilities, be able to monitor things, to be able to assess performance of those assets, and also support settlements and then payments and the penalties that those asset owners are exposed to with the services they committed to offer or a dispatching that they get involved in. In that context, the DERMS kind of functionalities enrolling into basically getting customers, qualifying them, enrolling them into various different programs, aggregating their capabilities into the so-called virtual power plant for supply of different services, forecasting capabilities of those assets, optimizing utilization of those assets, scheduling dispatch and control, monitoring and verification and settlements become important functionalities that perhaps didn't exist in the past, and it is fast growing and it's becoming an important part of running power system because of the growth of customer-owned or third-party owned assets that are participating on the distribution side to support the system operations. The users of DERMS, certainly control center operators, need to have access to the information through their ADMS and through the integration or directly through the DERMS. But the users of the DERMS also involve customer service organization that enrolls the customers and assesses the capabilities that those customer-owned assets and tariffs and commercial aspects of those enrollments, as well as commercial operation of the utility, whether it's the interactions with the ISOs, the markets, aggregation, payments and settlements and things of that nature. So there is also a kind of a group, basically user-based differentiation that DERMS introduces. If you move to the next slide, there were a number of questions put forward, which I'll try to answer them in a one by one in this regard. What groundworks needs to be laid before deployment of ADMS and DERMS? The fact that we are faced with a changing marketplace, changing power system environment, basically, with the introduction, with the growth of distributed resources, growth of renewable resources, and overall electrification aspects, being able to project requirements. The fact that these systems have a life of maybe 5 to 10 years, projecting requirements that a system that's going to be deployed, in a near future, what requirements it has to fulfill going forward in the future with respect to the functions that it has to have, the scale of the dimensionality of the system and number of assets, number of capabilities, number of entities and size of databases, etc. Performance of this system, how fast should we respond? These days, customers or everybody kind of used to with fast real-time reaction of the systems or this quick decision-making. So performance and of course cybersecurity becomes very important consideration. So looking at the projected requirements as a prior to the setting up requirements becomes very important. As Chris mentioned, system integration requirements and data availability becomes also very important. There are significant level of integration has to come for interoperability of this system with other utility systems, as well as type of data that has to be integrated and whether all information is available. For example, the fact that these assets sit at the edge of the grid, at the end of the distribution grid in large part. They're having the GIS information, network information for being able to model the system all the way to the edge of the grid and having accurate information. Some of those factors become important in groundwork that needed prior to deployment of these issues. Another very important element is the organizational and an operational alignment. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that we are dealing with a growing customer-owned assets and the different types of assets, and they impact reliability of the system, and then the being able to move beyond just controlling utility-owned, facilities, and being able to coordinate between control center operation, system operations, planning activities, engineering and field work, and being able to bring everybody in a operationally seamless kind of a approach. Our experience has been that is a work in progress, and there are still some silos within the utilities that kind of maybe create some barriers for deployment of these systems and moving forward to fully leverage capabilities of distributed resources as we move forward. If we move to the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, and as Chris brought up, there is a whole host of integration requirements. Here, we are kind of showing some of those things, and then external integration as well as internal integrations, and then projects that we have been involved past so many years. Actually, the systems integration efforts and then interoperability and operational coordination, taking much more significant level of effort than actual technology itself. So it is very critical to look at all these different interfaces, integration requirements, to have a fully coordinated set of operations. If you move to the next slide, please. Another question that was posed is, what are the costs associated with deployment of ADMS and DERMS? There are some similar functionalities, certainly technology costs in terms of licensing and hardware and system staging and integration, as we talked about, and configuration, and an overall rollout of the system. However, there are some differences. What is happening these days in the industry, it seems that there is a kind of an interesting angle emerging that ADMSs are typically deployed at the utility. They are on-premise systems that are physically the hardware and the software deployed at the utility for the support in general form. However, there is this trend that the DERMS is the functionality of DERMS kind of coming on the cloud, secured cloud-based offering. And because of the difference within nature of those two deliveries, the nature of cost is changing. Whereas on the cloud, it is more service-oriented offering, software as a service, whereas on the ADMS is more deployed systems. And that creates some differences in an O&M type cost going forward for operation of these systems. And we are seeing that trend in requests for proposals or overall interactions with the customers across the nation in a kind of fairly systematic. DERMS are predominantly being delivered in a cloud-based type environment, whereas ADMSs are deployed and on-premise type systems. And as a result, there are differences in overall some of the cost elements there. If you move to the next slide, please. Are utilities paying for ADMS and DERMS? And certainly the whole issue of getting approval through the commission and the commissions and launching the projects is very important, step in this process. But we are also seeing that seeing the difference between the IOUs and then co-ops and munis. Actually, what we are seeing happening in the industry, some of the smaller entities, especially GNTs and co-ops, because of them directly facing customers and the customer needs and things of that nature, and focused more on a customer-oriented services, they are moving much more aggressively in embracing distributed resources, microgrids, and their capabilities. We are seeing a fair amount of movement that utilities or smaller entities, co-ops and munis, embracing microgrids to provide resiliency to the customers, utilizing those distributed resources for economic purposes, while there is no need for resilience if grid operating properly, and that whole trend of providing DERs and stacking values, and it's not just reliability or negative impact on the grid, but basically looking at it as a resource that delivers value, resiliency, and can even help reliability of the grid, provide voltage support or a load management, and also can be used as a generation source or load adjustment source that to deliver value, they have been embracing those much more rapidly. And in that context, a lot of the co-ops and smaller entities leveraging customer investment by enabling customers to go forward and deploy things and then offer lending hand or support the substation adjustments or the control system to support those have customers invest in the assets, but they facilitate integration of it with the grid and monetization of the capabilities. It becomes a win-win scenarios. And we see more of that at the smaller entities rather than larger utilities. If you move to the next slide, please. And finally, how have ADMS and DERMS been deployed by utilities across the country? And as I mentioned, we are seeing that smaller utilities on the ADMS start with a distribution SCADA and then move to basically demand response and DERMS functionality. They consider the fact that the distribution system is not as complex, and the fact that the DERMS provides some level of visibility to the distributed resources, and the SCADA brings in the data for conditions and alarms and things of that nature. We see more movement on the smaller entities that adopting DERMS as much as ADMS, whereas larger utilities, certainly ADMS or DMS and distribution SCADA is predominant, important functionality that has to be there, and then moves to the DERMS or demand response systems. Some of the observation we have had is that the DMSs typically cover the primary side of the distribution circuit and don't go all the way down to the customer delivery point at the edge of the grid. And then DERMS can build that gap and provide information to the ADMS for representing the grid edge assets and behind the meter assets and the capabilities constrained by tariffs or other commercial constraints. The FERC Order 2222 actually enhances the need for a DERMS, but at the same time, it creates the need for a DSO type functionality for making sure that the participation of assets in the wholesale market, and what I showed at the beginning, to provide grid services, provide support to the bulk power side of operation, does not have any negative impact on distribution reliability. So the FERC order actually amplifies the need for both ADMS and DERMS, and I'm bringing those together. This is not a small task. There are a lot of issues that have to be addressed to achieving those elements, and the industry working diligently, and then there are a lot of activities going on, and it's primarily driven because of the economics, customers deploying these DERs, and systems have to deal with them. If we move on, I think that's, if you move to the next one, I think, thank you. Oh, we have one more. Is the phasing or scaling up options with the early ADMS and DERMS investments? Absolutely. We are faced with a changing marketplace, growing resources, and as I mentioned, there are organizational issues, alignment within the operations, these things impacting broader utility operations, and as a result, it is advisable to start approaching that in a phased deployment, phased integration, with the consideration that as we move forward, the scale and the performance and functionality going to expand. That is given. And I think, especially with electrification of transportation, we are faced with a fair amount of challenges, but also there are values to be created that has to be considered. But the phasing is a very, very advisable approach. Please, next slide, please. I think, thank you very much, and I look forward, if there are any questions, I can answer at the end. Thank you much.
Thank you, Dr. Apakchi. I thought that presentation was very interesting, and I have a question that I'd like to ask. I'll be asking at the end, but we're starting to get some questions as well in the Q&A, but I think I'm going to wait until everybody's done presenting to get to those questions. But that was a very thoughtful presentation. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ted Burhans. Ted, looking forward to hearing what you have to say in your presentation.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Commissioner Sullivan, and thank you, Nair, for having SEPA here, and good afternoon, everyone. As was said earlier, my name is Ted Burhans. I'm the Director of DER Technology for SEPA, which is the Smart Electric Power Alliance. If you're not familiar with SEPA, we're a nonprofit educational alliance that essentially we help regulators, utilities, educational institutions, all kind of understand what is out there and how they can get towards a zero carbon future. So we don't advocate, we just basically get the information and provide the facts to folks. So today I want to give you an overview of our DERMS collaborative study and learnings from that. And actually you've gotten a really great basis for DERMS from the previous presenters. So a lot of what you're going to hear from me just reinforces what's already been said. So it's always nice when that comes out. So next slide, please. So first off, the first few slides are just to give an overview of our collaborative study that we just finished up earlier this fall, and it was with 12 clients. So these are all utilities from across the country, ranging in size from a couple 100,000 or 100,000 all the way up to several million customers. So it was a very wide-ranging client-funded project. And we really wanted to look at what the capabilities of DERMS are today. It wasn't necessarily to say how to roll out a DERMS. You can't really just pick it up and point to a page and go, I'm going to do that. It's more just a snapshot of where things are at and where various utilities are at in their DERMS evolution. So the project itself was about 1.5 years or so, and it was broken up into essentially 3 different areas that you see on the right. You had the vendor demos and summaries, the creation of a DERMS encyclopedia, and then finally implementation considerations and alternatives. So for the vendor demos and summaries, we went and basically blanketed the DERMS landscape of software availability and really picked out what all the different capabilities were from each one of those vendors. From there, we then created the DERMS encyclopedia. So using all of the modules, seeing who had matching modules, who had unique modules, we created the encyclopedia and then developed use cases from it. After that, and this was, again, all in conjunction with the utilities that were participating in the study. After that, really taking all of the knowledge of DERMS, and when I say encyclopedia, it's over 100 pages or so. It's very comprehensive. We took all of that information and started to build out use cases and alternatives. So what happens if you want to go with a phased approach? Here's some things that might be able to work well for you as your utility, just given where you are in the overall evolution of DERMS. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Encyclopedia of DERMS, very comprehensive. You can see there's a snapshot of the module inventory there. So I know it's a little bit of a hard to read on the screen, but it essentially confirms what's already been provided, especially by Dr. Apakchi, on what the various modules are for DERMS. And then we started to say, okay, as you deploy a DERMS, this is where a module might come in. So behind it, you see that registration, that's registration of DER devices. Can a DERMS do that? Probably not at first, but eventually you hope that that's going to be part of a full-blown DERMS implementation. So we wanted to do an overview of the functions. Which use cases do they support? What's the market availability? Does one vendor have this, or do 10 vendors have this? Just kind of showing, hey, this is what's out there. We didn't come up with a recommendation on an overall preferred vendor. It was just more of this. These are the current capabilities of each one of the vendors that was solicited. And then finally, what are the technical considerations as you deploy a DERMS? What are the prerequisites? So it's, it was mentioned that ADMS and then going into a demand response management system. Maybe those are what need to be deployed prior to the level of DERMS that your utility wants to deploy. So really making sure that those prerequisites were accounted for, and then calling out what the key integrations and requirements were. Next slide, please. So a big part of the overall project was to look at alternatives and implementation considerations. A lot of utilities, even the ones that were part of this project, they're not ready to implement a DERMS yet. They're on a path that is very much phased. So they wanted to see what are the alternatives that they could go down or implement prior to a full DERMS, prior to even an ADMS. I would say about half of the 12 or so that were part of the study did not have an ADMS, but it was on their roadmap for 2 to 3 years. So 2 to 3 years, that probably means that a DERMS is in the 5 to 6 year period if they're going to go down that path. So we wanted to look and say, okay, if you need to, here are some other ways that you can take your base case and add onto it to eventually get to a full DERMS. Next slide, please. So that was a little bit about the study. And now we'll go into some of what the, I would say the utility perspectives are. These are certainly not necessarily representative of SEPA's perspectives, but again, it's an aggregation of what we were able to get out of the study. So next slide, please. So DERMS drivers, what are the drivers for utilities? Of implementation of a DERMS for a utility. Obviously, the biggest one that we've seen, and it's been said earlier on the call as well, is just DER adoption. Customers are going to want it, whether the utility is ready for it or not. There's a lot of drivers that go into this, decreasing costs, et cetera. So just really being ready to make sure that you as a utility can take advantage of that, and also manage it in a safe and effective way. Existing types of technologies deployed. So it's called out here on the utility side, that grid visibility. Can you see down to the transformer level with an ADMS system, or are you implementing that, or so whether or not that's available today certainly will have an impact on when you implement a DERMS system. Security, we as utilities, security is always a big issue. So going on further, whether the devices are customer owned or utility owned, that will play a big role in whether the DERMS gets implemented sooner rather than later. And then on the customer side, what are customers installing today? Solar PV, thermostats, batteries, electric vehicles, participating in customer programs. There's a whole gamut that they can deploy, and the utility just has to be more reactive until they get to a DERMS level. Costs, obviously costs, as it was mentioned before, there's different ways to pay for systems such as an ADMS versus a DERMS. So the utility has to be cognizant of when they can build that into their budget or get cost recovery on it. And then certainly regulations for 2022, while it was mentioned that there are still issues with it, and that the overall plans are not consistent across the country or have not necessarily been approved across the country, there's the expectation that that will have a large impact on utilities. And so utilities have to be ready for that and understand whether it's at the DSO level or whether it's at that third-party aggregator level. How are they going to impact, or how is it going to impact them? How are they going to interact and integrate those DERs into their systems? Next slide, please. So the benefits. So the current state of DER management is really a whole bunch of different screens. It's very piecemeal. You can see up on the chart on the left, you've got just AC switches, thermostats, water heaters, behavioral programs, other mass market programs that are rolled out by third parties, automated commercial and industrial programs, customer initiated programs. They're not even doing it with the utility involved, and then other C&I programs. All of those today sit in their own silo. Each one of those has essentially a screen. And we've all heard that operators don't want to have any more screens. They want it all to be essentially one easy button for them. So it's very difficult if that's not available to them. Low yield programs, if you're not getting the yield in megawatts from a thermostat program as you might get from a demand response commercial program, you're probably not going to be too excited about having to hit two of those buttons at the same time. And then it's a lot of these programs are also very passive right now. The customer has solar. We just have that solar just has to get injected to the grid, and there's no real way to control it. But hopefully, active management is the goal through DERMS, and you have more of that orchestration, which is where you see on the right side, you have the future state of DER management. Essentially, it's aggregating all of the devices that are out there. So talking thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, if not more, simplifying. So streamlining the settings and data, again, bringing that down into one screen, automating the system so that it's coordinating, so it's orchestrating, then coordinating, and finally forecasting what the DERs are actually going to be doing. So it is a technological leap from the current state, but it's what is really believed to be necessary to get us there. Next slide, please. So cost considerations, as most utilities are pretty conservative. And so there's not a lot of room for extra projects usually. So we've seen that internal resources and budgets are a very big driver. So what are the current in-play and software deployments? Are the key personnel available to even do the project? Do you have all of the right folks in the room at the same time? When can you get that meeting set up to actually do it? That might be a ways away. So really making sure that you have that within your IT budget, within your energy management system budget, all of those have to be coordinated years in advance. Regulatory environment on costs. This is one that we did not have a real good summation on. Whether utilities are looking at it from a rate-based perspective, is their regulatory environment one that they can put this into a pre-test year or post-test year? Will it even be considered? Customer programs, can it be wrapped into an energy efficiency or renewable energy program? Or maybe just get pre-approval for a regulatory asset and do a pilot program. Those are all certainly options. I'm sure there's more out there, but there's no real good clear line on how this gets paid for. And then finally, the cost considerations of ownership of devices. Are all of the devices going to be third-party owned, either the customer or an aggregator? Will the utility have the opportunity to own DER devices? Or then will it be market driven and we don't really get that visibility? It'll just come through to us from an aggregator. So again, those are three of the main drivers from cost considerations that utilities are experiencing. Next slide, please. So what is the state of utility deployment? I know one of the questions in the Q&A was how many DER or DERMS are out there. I would say certainly from our perspective, it's too early to kind of give a blanket number on that. A lot of utilities are not experiencing DER penetration to the level they believe a full-scale DERMS is necessary. As I said before, there's a lot of individual screens and software that are being used today, demand response, thermostats. All of those are popped up in different programs. Visibility is primary. So utilities often want to see things, and then control is the future state. So you've got to kind of crawl, walk, run to get there. And as it's been mentioned before, timelines are phased and they're very unique to each utility. There's not one set to say, as soon as you do an ADMS, you should do a DERMS within the next year. Some utilities are saying, as I mentioned before, they're saying, 2-3 years for an ADMS. They'll follow along later in a couple of years after that, going to a DERMS. So you can see just a similar timeline as it was shown before, getting the visibility, putting an example of an ADMS, getting all the way down to the transformer level. What is the current DER deployment at that grid edge? And then exploring to see what is available. What are the use cases that we need as a utility to have the DERMS be able to essentially take care of. Then design and implementation. Typically, we're hearing about 2 years or so, and it requires a large number of utility departments. And then target 3 to 5 years from now could be when your DERMS gets fully up and running. So it is very much a long-term phased approach. And then finally, next slide, please. So based on our study and based on the information from all the utilities that we've talked to, start early. Regardless of the utility sophistication, planning can always start now. You don't know When or how quickly DERs are going to be deployed. As I mentioned, customer adoption is not going to stop. Certainly with things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the overall declining costs of DERs, customers are going to just continue to deploy, and the utility does not want to be in a position where they're on their heels. Look at a phased approach. As it's been said many times, this phased approach is the best way to do this. And then certainly for utilities, review use cases of similar utilities. So IOUs, co-ops, munis, small, large, mid-major, all of those will have a different perspective on it. And those learnings should be taken and used in your own utility. So next slide with that. I think I'm right at time. So I appreciate you all and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Ted. Interesting presentation. I thank you for answering one of the questions in the that's also in the Q&A. I just want to maybe quick follow up on that one since you answered most of it. But if you had a crystal ball, how many years away do you think we are from seeing widespread deployment of system-wide DERMS?
I would say crystal ball would be the probably in the 2026, 27 range. Most utilities, again, ADMS is still even a new concept for a lot of utilities. So, those implementations take a very long time. So there's a lot of just kind of hangover effect, I would say. So get the ADMS up and running, get your, DR management systems if you've got demand response, and then kind of work your way into a DERM. So I would get, by the time we hit the next decade, 2030, I think you will have the majority of utilities have some level of DERMs, if not by choice, just because they have to deal with the various DERs that are on their grid.
Thank you. Now I will turn to Commissioner Peretick from Michigan. Looking forward to hearing Michigan's progress on ADMS and DERMS, and it's nice to see you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Sullivan. Yeah, so I come to the Michigan Public Service Commission with a background in technology, specifically energy storage technology, so a form of a distributed energy in some instances, as well as energy storage project development. So I always enjoy talking about new technologies and the evolution of the electric grid towards a more distributed, reliable, and sustainable future. I personally have been on the Michigan Commission for just under 2 years. So many of the decisions and the thought processes throughout that I will be describing in this presentation were before my time. However, we're continually reviewing the new utility expenditures for the continued spending. So I've had to thoroughly learn about these investments and their performance and continue to make decisions on funding and evaluation, and including right now on an open rate case that's in front of us currently. So please don't be offended if I can't answer any specific questions due to ex parte restrictions. I'm trying to keep things appropriate here. I'm going to try to get fairly specific, though, about some of the decisions that have already been made and some of the ways that we've been thinking about ADMS and DERMS at the Michigan Public Service Commission throughout my presentation. But as always, please do keep in mind that these are my perspectives alone and the Commission only speaks through its orders. So with that, we can get started. First slide, please. I'll go over an overview of our approach to ADMS and DERMS investments. So we, the Commission, have, through our orders, evaluated ADMS and DERMS investments as a reasonable and prudent response to industry trends and to the system requirements. So distributed energy penetration continues to grow quickly across the state of Michigan, as we just heard from Ted. And the need for distribution upgrades is concurrently growing quickly. So, and also with FERC Order 2222, that makes the DER growth even more likely and will also prompt the need for these smart management systems. As you see on the slide, we've been hit with a few, well, more than a few over the past years, pretty bad storms that have rolled through Michigan. This is the pictures you see on the slide there as an example from about 6 weeks ago. That there was a storm that rolled through. It actually only lasted 8 minutes, but the strong wind gusts took out power to hundreds of thousands of our residents and resulted in some downed wires that led to multiple fatalities. We expect to see an increasing frequency of these storms due to climate change, and are hoping that a fully scaled ADMS and outage management system can help make the system more resilient by streamlining data tracking as well as down wire responses to more efficiently organize work orders and bring power back to customers in real time as a response to these storms. This storm in particular also occurred the first or second week of school for many of the local schools, and they were out of power in many cases for days, right at the very beginning of the school year. So better management of these outages with more of an ability to isolate the problem as well as prioritize the critical facilities and the high impact facilities like schools is really necessary. And we're hoping that the deployment of our ADMS systems in Michigan will start to help with this. So where we stand now, the Commission has approved ADMS and DERMS investments in previous utility rate cases, but these investments do require that proper planning and integration with our distribution plans, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. And just for a quick overview of Michigan's utility landscape, we have we have two major electric utilities in the state of Michigan that are approximately equal sized that cover 80% of our customers. So when I'm talking about these two major utilities, that's why, because they're about the same size and they cover most of our state's customers, and both of them are in current deployment of ADMS. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and talk about how these investments fit into the broader planning context. So as I mentioned, our Michigan utilities have included outlines of their ADMS and DERMS planning in multiple venues. So in IRPs, Integrated Resource Planning, we use that process in the state of Michigan, as well as we go through 5 year, and the IRPs extend planning from 5, 10, and 15 years into the future. And that's planning on the resource side. And then we also in Michigan have distribution plans, which look 5 years into the future and plan the distribution side of the utilities infrastructure. I'm going to talk for just a minute now about the importance of distribution plans in Michigan. So the Public Service Commission first directed utilities to file these 5 year distribution plans with the Commission in late 2017. And given the level of investment being made in the electric distribution system, it seemed like a necessary step to take. And it's really important for understanding these longer term investment strategies in the distribution system, as well as cost benefits and other effects on the customers. And it's really just the goal of providing that transparency into the utilities processes to identify those areas of need. So the Michigan's two largest utilities have filed 2 iterations of these distribution plans, and it includes heavy stakeholder engagement and input over the years. The Commission just last month issued an order trying to refine the inputs that are required as a part of these distribution plans that requires more reporting, more measurement, and real measurable improvements to result from the distribution system investment, including a proposal for PBR for downed wires, as well as some strategic pilot proposals and a work group that's going to start on financial incentives and penalties, or PBR performance-based regulation, to address outages and distribution performance by the end of this year. The ADMS data tracking that we have in Michigan right now, we're hoping will both improve the wire down response and work order management, and which will hopefully mean fewer SAIDI minutes, the System Average Interruption Duration Index, which is the graph that's on the screen right there. So one of our major utilities in their proposal for funding for ADMS claims that it'll reduce that SAIDI, ADMS will reduce that SAIDI, those number of minutes, by 29 to 60 minutes in all-weather SAIDI. And that was the number that we based the approval on. All right, next slide. So regarding specific requests, so these are the questions that we went through while trying to evaluate, and that we're still going through, trying to evaluate the reasonable and prudence of the decisions to fund these projects. Lots of these do overlap with the list of questions that Chris presented in his presentation. And in the interest of time, I am going to skip through these because you will have access to this presentation after the event. So we can move on to the next slide, and I can talk through the Commission's approach to the question of timing of these investments. So for the timing, it's the same process that we go through for all investments that we review for the utilities. It really just needs to be a reasonable and prudent investment. We look at the potential for scalability for these projects, and as Ted described, the DER penetration and growth projection, which is that chart there on the right side of the screen. So looking at that growth projection, as well as, of course, the cost to customers and the data requirements that are required to roll out the ADMS in Durham from both SCADA systems and from advanced metering infrastructure, AMI systems. And it really is a comprehensive review of plans between our IRPs, our integrated resource planning process, our distribution planning process, and the rate cases where cost recovery occurs. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So how is it paid for? This is a quote from one of the orders that, or one of the cases that approved one of our first ADMS systems that I thought was really interesting. And there was a lot of testimony back and forth, of course, as in any rate case, for approving such a large investment. And you know, there was a lot of people on the side of opposing because the technology was, you know, new and not yet proven, or that those minutes of SAIDI, which equated to about you know, I guess 5% SAIDI savings, were insufficient to justify the cost. And I do have the cost there on the screen for you too. They asked for a $65 million total ask with $58 million ultimately included in the rate base. And this is for one of our utilities that serves about 2.5 million customers. I have that in my notes somewhere. I will correct that if that number is wrong. Looking at the actual claim, the basis for approval was in the significant improvements in reliability, the integration with distributed resources, and the substation outage risk reduction that was offered by ADMS, as well as the fact that it's becoming commonplace in the industry. There were plenty of conditions, of course, that were a part of this approval, you know, dependent on detailed justification of cost, contextualized within long-term scope of the distribution plans, and then also making sure that there was a quantification and explanation of all of the related costs that comprise the total investment. For DERMS, so that was all for ADMS. For DERMS in particular, the commission actually issued an order against funding the first DERMS proposal, saying that it lacked clarity and that the company failed to explain how reliability would benefit from the DERMS program, or how the information that would be generated from the program would be integrated into the reliability program on the grounds that DER penetration was simply too low. So as a result of that order, the commission encouraged the utility to include additional detail about how DERMS and other technologies will be sequenced and utilized for the benefit of its customers in future plans. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. And this is my final slide. I'll just run very quickly through the federal funding. So another potential for funding for these programs is through both the IIJA and the IRA. There is about $5 billion in grant funding as a part of the IIJA for fiscal years 22 through 26 for preventing outages and improving grid resilience, as well as an additional $3 billion for smart grid investment. And then for the IRA funds, there's the Green Bank and Clean Energy Accelerator that has $27 billion in funding available for qualified clean energy projects focusing on disadvantaged communities, where qualified projects mean projects that assist communities in their efforts to reduce or avoid GHG emissions. So lots of money out there, lots of excitement about this right now, and we're really happy about the progress that's being made in Michigan on this front, and are really looking forward to all of the advantages that these new technologies will be able to bring to Michigan's customers for reliability and resiliency.
Thank you, Commissioner Peretick. I have had the I've had the honor to be on a panel with one of Commissioner Peretick's colleagues recently, and just listening to you today, I'm always it's always impressed how similar our two states are approaching the same issues, and so thank you for your presentation. I'm going to turn now to the questions that are remaining in the chat. Dr. Apache is doing great work answering these questions on his own.
Yeah, I'm kind of spot, but the questions are very good questions.
Yeah,
and I'm just put a brief answer. Each one of them, we can talk, great amount. Please feel free to ask the questions. I'm not trying to basically.
No, I appreciate that you're answering the questions. That's helpful. The question that's outstanding, I think we could answer this relatively quickly, and it's an open question, but I think Chris, you had answered it, or you spoke to it in your presentation. But the question is, when it comes to the phased approach that's been covered, what is the rationale for deploying ADMS before DERMS as opposed to in parallel? And if you could just speak to why a utility or why somebody would propose doing ADMS first and then do DERMS, I think that would be sufficient. And if there are any other options besides full ADMS deployment to obtain grid awareness.
Sure. So thank you, Commissioner Sullivan. So a reason why the phase approach would be more successful is that an ADMS investment is more of a least regrets investment compared to a DERMS investment. You need to do an ADMS investment in order to organize all the different components of utility operations. As we talked about previously in this webinar, there's a lot of components of utility operations and planning that need to be coordinated really before you jump into anything beyond leveraging, dispatching, or what have you of the DER itself that's going on behind the scenes. So making sure that the AMI data management system is fully integrated with an ADMS as well as the outage management and DRMS, or all sorts of things. Those all really need to be organized and integrated up front before you then start moving on to a DERMS deployment. As for other ways to gather that information, if you go back and go through a document and look at the order from the Kentucky Commission, for example, and the Kentucky Commission was in a similar situation as Commissioner Paratik's situation in Michigan, which is the utility asked for significant investment in DERMS despite its service territory having very low amounts of solar penetration. And what the Kentucky Commission asked the utility is, to what extent has the utility looked at using other technologies such as the solar advanced inverter to gather information about operations and performance before looking at an investment in DERMS? And there certainly are alternative ways to gather more granular information other than jumping right into a DERMS, including being able to access the data coming off an advanced inverter. And so it really does then go back to this planning function, as noted in Ted's presentation, which is, you really have to identify what are your goals for each of these investments. When are these investments needed? And one of the things we found in our report really comes that we heard from commissions is that if they approve a DERMS too early, it's going to sit unused for a long period of time, which then just becomes an unused capital investment. And by the time that the DERMS becomes useful, the DERMS that was invested previously is now outdated. So now they need to do an upgrade. So now they have to do another capital investment. And so really tying these investments to a plan so that they're implemented at appropriate times for when they're needed is a really important component of this conversation, as well as looking at what other alternatives are out there other than this DERMS that can get you from A to B.
Thanks, Chris. I kind of, in my own kind of trying to simplify these things, it's a very, very complicated area. There's a lot of cognitive load. But I tend to think of this as like the ADMS is like the App Store, and DERMS and all the other things are the software that fits into the App Store. You may, or people may disagree with that, but that's the way that I try to think about it, and that it's an enabling technology. So another question that I'm going to actually just, Dr. Apache, you had your observation before. We've answered most of the questions in the Q&A now, but you had made an observation before, and I wanted to ask you, what should regulators of investor-owned utilities make of your observation that smaller customer-owned utilities are moving faster? I thought that was an interesting point. Utilities that are focused on, their customer-owned utilities, that they're moving faster. And in particular, I'm reflecting on our determination in Minnesota with our largest utility, Xcel Energy, which is similar size to similar size to the two utilities that Commissioner Paratik had mentioned. I remember in making our determination to certify it, that it was, that it was complicated and difficult, and that it was hard to. I mean, we got there, but the benefits of the ADMS system and the proposal were not articulated as well as they should have been. So there's a lot there, but I'm very interested in your observation and what we as regulators should think about, that these customer-owned utilities that are extremely cost-sensitive are implementing this, and how that at a higher rate than IOUs are. And anyways,
yeah,
go from there.
The way I think this is a very good question. I think what we are observing is that being able to stack different values on top of each other, it can certainly, larger utilities and IOUs, due to their size, organizationally functions are separated. Smaller entities, they have a smaller staff, coordination between activities done much quicker, etc. So being able to kind of look at that, I have a demand response program. My customer wants to have resiliency. My customer installing DERs. If I go talk with that customer, have them allow me to control their assets when I want to control, and I'll use it for demand response, use it for market operation, provide them resiliency capability, et cetera, we can bring all these things together. And as a result, when you stack up the values on top of each other, the cost effectiveness drastically improves. So the smaller utilities, what we have been seeing, have the ability to coordinate better internally between different parts of their operation, and also directly talk with customers. That examples are, customer wants to install a battery and PV because they want to be, resilient if just in case the grid goes down. And the utility looks at it just as an interconnection issue versus this is an opportunity for me to be able to aggregate and control those things. So if I facilitate that interconnection easier and the customer, this ongoing upgrade, the relay protection to allow this and that, etc., becomes partnering arrangement with the customer, everybody is happy. Customer is happy. Utility was more cooperative. Utility getting value out of it, etc., etc. But often in the larger utilities, demand response is done by customer services. That's separate department on separate docket. DER operation is separate docket, separate activities, etc., etc. And these are not coordinated, and the values are not stacked. And to me, for example, the demand response management and DERMS, long haul, got to merge together. This is a customer, the end of the grid, flexibility of distribution system. We are leveraging flexibility at the edge of the grid, whether it is a battery, whether it's a PV, or whether it's just a thermostat. They all have similar effects. Maybe technically one can inject VARs and support voltage and the other cannot, but business-wise, there are similar capabilities. But often at the larger utilities, there are separate dockets associated with different things. There are separate tariffs, separate budgets, and even organizationally within the utility, there are separate parts of their organization that handles these things. And as a result, stacking values becomes difficult.
Thank you for that answer. That was very helpful to me, and I appreciate that. We have another question in the Q&A, and this conversation about when and whether to deploy DERMS seems to underscore the importance of DER forecasting, and meaning we can't justify a DERMS unless we think there will be a lot of DER growth. Whose forecasts? The utilities, state agencies are typically relied on to assess whether or not DERMS are justifiable. I think that question, I'm going to just open it up to any one of you who has a good thought on that one.
Whichever one is right. I think I think that it's up to whoever's approving the investment to believe in the forecast, right? Like I don't think there's one particular entity that needs to be that is the truth. You just it needs to be believable.
Yeah,
I can say from my perspective, that's right. I totally agree with that.
Maybe I can make a comment in that regard. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of issue. For example, if one does long-term planning, if incorporating the impact of demand-side flexibility in resource planning, if it's not incorporated, then the values are not laid out on the forecast on how you incentivize or how you go forward. Kind of get biased with the more conventional models, whereas many feel and many studies have shown that if you incorporate the flexibilities available in the demand side, especially with the modern appliances and modern and electrification that's coming about, and communication capabilities, there is significant cost savings can be had. And that also impacts what type of incentives there may be there, or interconnection kind of a facilitation or other things that could improve the forecast. So it is a little bit of a kind of a work in progress, I think.
Are there any additional thoughts on that? Otherwise, I have one. It's not a lightning round, it's a lightning question, because we are running out of time. We only have 2 more minutes. But unless Chris, Ed, if you want to add anything to that.
I'll add quick. The only thing I would say is certainly from an individual utilities perspective, look, they need to show that there has been some growth. I believe that, look at the past adoption rates, but compare them to other similarly situated utilities, whether it's an IOU, whether it's a muni, whether it's in their region or not. But even then, the crystal ball is not going to be correct, other than just knowing it's going to keep going up. But an example, just a real quick one, is the Inflation Reduction Act. As of March, all of SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, all of their forecasts had a big dip in adoption over the second half of this year. And then that ticked back up as soon as that bill was passed. So again, to Commissioner Paratek's point, the correct forecast is is the best one.
Yeah, thank you. We're now at time. I can ask my last question, and maybe we can just do a quick yes, no, or follow up later. But my last thought was in evaluating prudency and evaluating the prudency of these investments. Chris, you had mentioned that it's important to have some type of planning construct so that regulators understand what's the vision for ADMS and DERMS. So quickly, should we, in evaluating ADMS or DERMS and evaluating this, should like an integrated distribution planning or some type of planning be a prerequisite? And before we do that, so quickly, Dr. Chris.
Go
for it.
I'd say quickly, yes. Yeah, I'd say yes, that should be a prerequisite, because it also helps identify what level of control you're anticipating the utility to have.
Great. Ted?
I would say maybe not to the point of a full integrated distribution planning process or docket, but certainly some type of roadmap that shows that the utility and all of the affected departments have thought about this, have devised what and determined what their use case is going to be. And to Chris's point, what is the command and control capability going to be? I think that should be some type of prerequisite.
Dr. Apakchi.
Ali, yes.
Ali,
yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Commissioner Paratek.
So we evaluate all of our decisions based on reasonable and prudence in rate cases. So it needs to be reasonable. If it proves to be a reasonable and prudent investment in a rate case, then it should be approved. But I really like distribution planning.
All right. Well, thank you. I like that. I think this is a good way to wrap up. I really appreciate all the panelists, and again, NARUC, for inviting me to be the moderator here. I think this has been a good conversation. I hope everybody got their questions answered. And with that, I will turn it back over to Danielle. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much again. Those were truly informative presentations. I am sure that I'm not the only one who learned a lot today in the last hour and a half. We just wanted to invite all of our attendees and panelists to join us at other upcoming events. I put the webinar registration link in the chat, and I wanted to reiterate that the presentation recording for today, plus a written summary, will be posted on the NARUC website as well. So we look forward to seeing you at future events, and thank you again so much for your time.